Hello and welcome to Hawkeye Nation. This is HawkCast, your Iowa football, basketball, and recruiting podcast brought to you by Hawkeye Beacon and Rivals.com. I'm your recruiting analyst and host, Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter, joined by publisher Adam Jacoby and managing editor Ross Binder. Before we get started, make sure that you subscribe here on YouTube if you're watching. Drop a like, drop a comment. Let us know what you're thinking heading into this Northwestern game this weekend against the Wildcats in Kinnick Stadium. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, you might be listening, but not subscribed. So make sure you do that. Leave that rate and review. It does seriously help us out a lot. So we would greatly appreciate that. So before we get talking too much about the matchup with Northwestern this weekend, we did not have Ross on the mic with us after the Michigan State loss. So we just wanted to go to him for a third perspective. In conversations about these losses, I'd like to think we don't go the route of the sky is falling, right? But I think it's a level of criticism that's deserved, or analysis that's deserved. So I guess I wanted to go to you here, Ross, because we're a few days removed. But Adam and I really just were like, well, CFP's out the window. Cade wasn't good enough. Defense was bad tackling. So I guess, did you have any extra thoughts or regarding any of those topics, or anything else from the loss against the Spartans, the 32-20 loss to the Spartans in East Lansing?
Yeah, I mean it was a rough game to watch on Saturday. As far as the playoff stuff goes, that was always kind of on a lifeline anyway. So that one I don't think was a huge thing. The thing that definitely stood out to me the most from that game, in a very negative way, was the play of the defense. Like, we have definitely seen issues on that side of the ball this year. Giving up more big plays, especially through the passing game. But just in terms of an overall systems failure on that side of the ball, that was a real eye opener on Saturday. Like, just bad tackling, bad angles, bad positioning, just so many plays where Michigan State guys were wide open, or when they would run the ball, they would get such a great push up front and get through holes so quickly. And there was, just the defense that we've, been accustomed to seeing from Iowa for definitely the last few years, and for the most part this year. Like, it just was not present. Like, I don't know, lack of energy, lack of something, but that was really eye opening. I don't think, for the most part, that doesn't seem like something, because it is so unusual. It doesn't feel like something that, oh, Iowa's defense suddenly bad. What's going to happen now? Like, it feels like it was just a really, really bad day. But although there are some real issues with the defense too. The second cornerback position is uh, that's a big concern, because they've tried a lot of guys there, and no one is excelling in that role right now, at all. Michigan State picked on both Hall and Nestor with just, if that was grade school, they would have been written up for bullying what they were doing. It was mean. Um, so that was really what stood out to me. The struggles of the offense. Like, I don't know, anyone who's watched Iowa for the last 2.5 years at least couldn't have been surprised to see the offense struggling in the first half. That's par for the course, unfortunately. There were some good things in the second half, at least. Um, Vander Zee made some great catches to help them score a touchdown. Can't really call Caleb's touchdown a drive. It was one play, but it was a great play. I think that was probably the more concerning thing, was just a lack of consistency from the offense. They were not able to sustain drives really at all, especially in the first half. Um, and those issues are unlike the defense, which is more of a, holy crap, everything fell apart on, in this one game. The offensive issues have obviously been persistent for a very long time now, and with only, minor improvements, really.
So, couple things you said there. I talked to a few people, but behind the scenes, about the game and about the loss. We all kind of chalked it up as a blowout win for Iowa. And by what I've heard, it sounds like the staff was not was much more wary of Spartans than we were, and then the guys on the roster were. Just on based on what they saw in film and everything like that. Michigan State's an underrated athletic team, and we saw that. That's what the staff expected. And I think Iowa got caught flat-footed a little bit. It's almost like that that play where X got beat deep against Iowa State is like a microcosm of what happened against the Spartans.
I thought
So
Michigan, yeah, you mentioned their speed. Michigan State had a lot more speed on offense than I realized. I definitely would agree with that. And it's the defense, like, we saw it against Washington where the defense struggled to adapt in those first two drives. Washington was just kind of steadily moving the ball down the field and doing what they wanted practically. But then there were adjustments made, and the defense was much better the rest of the game. So if you're watching the game from an Iowa perspective on Saturday, I think you were expecting probably the same things. Like, all right, Sparty had their great start. Iowa wasn't expecting it, but they'll adjust, and they never adjusted. Like there was never any adaptation or uh, doing anything that was able to slow down the Spartans. I mean, the most mind-blowing stat from Saturday for me is the fact that Michigan State did not ever punt and was never in any. Well, I guess there was about one time I think where there was a chance where they might have punted. Like I think they had to get a longer third down conversion or something. But there were just very few situations where the defense put them in a position where their offense was kind of up against it, as it were. Like it looked very easy for the Michigan State offense.
Yeah, it sort of was like a ball that just started rolling downhill. And when you're playing a young team like Michigan State, a team that's still gelling and a quarterback that's still, maturing into the position like Aiden Childs, the worst thing that you can give them as an opponent is hope. And the fact that Michigan State was able to move the ball early and then, get stops on Iowa early, keep Iowa from converting third downs and then converting their own. And then you combine that with a well lubricated crowd in East Lansing. I mean, their crowd showed up great. And you could see the game just start to get away from Iowa. And whether it was guys pressing at that point, whether it was a lack of preparation, going into it, really rearing its ugly head at the worst moment, or like Nick Jackson said, just great play. Like that was probably by a wide measure, Michigan State's best game of the season. And at some point you gotta, tip your cap. At some point you gotta say, yeah, Nick Marsh was a dude, and he played like a dude. But yeah, to your point, Ross, Iowa's got a lot of stuff to shore up, and the defenders that we talked to all acknowledge the same thing. But at the end of the day, when the five defenders that graded the worst on PFF were all defensive backs, that is a pretty wide failure on that position group to stop what Michigan State was trying to doing. And yeah, you're right. They got to figure something out, especially at CB2. And the fact that we didn't even see Deshaun Lee last week, he's still listed as the starter, and Kirk confirmed that he wasn't hurt. It wasn't an injury. It was a DNP CD, but he's still the starter. A little odd. And you especially when you know that John Nestor was not playing up to par, and that TJ Hall wasn't playing up to par. Don't you throw in somebody else that you quite publicly say that you trust? Like that was weird. That was pretty weird.
if there's been any position this season that's seen the most turnover, it's obviously that second cornerback spot. And it's really interesting to see how much turnover there's been there, and see little to none at the quarterback spot other than in the red zone. And boy, oh boy, to segue more so into what's going on this week, Adam, you asked about the quarterback spot, and we actually got some pretty interesting answers from Kirk yesterday at the presser. Sounded like he was open to making a change. Also said it was all on more or less on Tim Lester's decision, which I don't believe for a second. And it was, I don't even know how to categorize it other than that, because it was just kind of odd. Like, you put on the board after the presser that you said you felt like Kirk was super open to change. And I pushed back a little bit and I said, we've heard things from Kirk about the quarterback spot for the last 5 to 10 years, and little to nothing's changed. Does he actually mean it this time? Because I'd be surprised. It's just odd, and the way that he went about it. And I can read some quotes. I'll pull up the quotes while you respond here, Adam.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just sort of read off what my question was and what his answer was, because it prompted some follow-up questions, especially from Chad Leistico, because he didn't really answer my question. I asked, what have you been seeing from Cade McNamara in practice that maybe you aren't seeing from Brendan Sullivan yet? Where is the opportunity for Sullivan to grow as a QB, to, close that gap? Because ultimately, when McNamara is getting these snaps, especially in between the 10-yard lines, not even between the 20s, between the 10s, and it's just all him on that. And Kirk always talks about how much, practice determines playing time. The logical question to ask there is, well, okay, where is McNamara distinguishing himself in practice? And Kirk's answer was, I think they're both doing a good job in practice. Game competition factors in severely. The guys that are playing, you have concrete examples, and then the guys that aren't out there, you're projecting a little bit. There's never 100% answer, typically, at least. But I think they're both doing a good job, and Cade has to play better, certainly the first half in particular. Cade's going to have to throw the ball a little bit more accurately. If I mentioned about the makeables, making the makeables, whether it's him or anybody else, we'll keep pushing forward from here. Guys, did you hear anything about what Sullivan needs to do better? Did you hear anything about what Cade does better in practice? Like, it was an enlightening answer. It also didn't answer my question. And that was illuminating to me, that I gave him as easy an opportunity as I could think of to differentiate QB1 and QB2 on his depth chart in the most like, all right, tell me why this is the case. And he didn't really take it. And the more that other people sort of pressed on that, and Leistico even asked, like, why aren't you using Sullivan in, third and shorts outside of that goal line situation? And Ferentz didn't push back on it, other than, like, at best he was like, yeah, you could see it both ways. But he never questioned the validity of Leistico's premise. And for somebody who is normally, I don't want to say combative, but often abrasive to outside suggestions and reporter suggestions about personnel, and the whole, like, well, you're not seeing what I see in practice, blah blah blah, did not hear a whole lot, if any, of that on Tuesday. And that, to me, was fascinating. And so that sort of, between that and the reporting that Chad did that Iowa was close on Saturday, if McNamara hadn't had that good third quarter, to actually pulling the trigger on a change, or at the very least, seeing what Sullivan could do for some amount of time. Between that and the way that Kirk handled this, I'm still not convinced that we don't see Sullivan in a few series or so against Northwestern. At the very least, I would imagine, especially with how bad Northwestern's pass defense is, if McNamara is not productive, especially in that first half, I am not so sure he's got 60 minutes of leash left on him. That it's just my read. That's not, I'm not reporting that. I'm not using a source here or anything like that, but knowing Kirk and knowing how he's been discussing this situation, this is a little bit different to me. especially coming out of his mouth. So that is, again, I'm just sort of trying to read the tea leaves and doing the Kirk Ferentz jazz session about what he doesn't say and blah, blah, blah. But that is where my perspective on that comes from. Eliot, what do you think?
There are a few things that stood out to me about a couple of those statements that you read. And the first thing is game competition factors in severely. Other than a wild throw to the sideline to try to avoid a sack or what have you by Sullivan, he's been pretty damn good when you've called upon him. And when things go off schedule, that horrible snap from Logan Jones where he had to catch it over his shoulder, turn around and run to the sideline was arguably the best play a quarterback has made this season, right? I mean,
low bar to clear. It's sort of like being the tallest kindergartner, but yeah, that's a good point.
Right. And so that's because he talks about with guys that aren't out there, you're projecting a little bit. Okay, well, are we talking about Marco now for some reason? And, they like to throw Marco into the conversation of 3, and they did at the beginning of the season. Marco was never going to be the starter. It's just he's not there yet. For Sullivan versus Cade, that was something that I thought was an odd way to answer the question. And then you referenced a couple of those things and Kirk's responses to Chad and regarding like the 3rd and 1 and stuff like that. And Kirk goes, you could make that argument. Well, yeah, you could because it's worked. Like
a lot of people do.
Right. And
it's like, I think Chad just did make that argument,
right,
Kirk.
Yeah. And he wrapped up that portion of the quote by, like I said, saying that ultimately it's Tim Lester's call. I tend to think that if it was Tim Lester's call, then it would have been called by now. Right? And one quote that sticks out from Lester's availability a couple weeks ago was he tried to push them throwing the deep ball at one point in time, but it was shot down by in a group session or something like that. That's not the exact quote. But what did everybody respond when that was tweeted out? Oh, so Kirk said no. Like that's where I think a good contingent of the frustration is with the fan base right now is you can say Tim's making the call, but we know who's making the call. And like, as much as Cade might have an advantage over or had an advantage over Brendan because of the spring, because he'd been around Lester a little bit, Lester had one of his guys in Sullivan. There's a reason they offered him out of high school, right? Sullivan adds a dynamic that Cade just doesn't have. And that's another thing that that Kirk has told us. And I think he said it a couple of weeks ago about Brendan. But I guess the thing that it comes down to that I've said to a few people is that added dynamic that you have to account for close to the goal line. Well, guess what? You might have to account for it the other 80 yards of the field.
I mean, look at what Childs did to Iowa's defense up and down the field on Saturday. They had to account for him. They didn't do a good job of it, but he was running all over the place.
The way that they did account for Childs, which is also illuminating to both of your guys' point, and also Eliot, if you needed any proof of concept, Brendan Sullivan ripping off a 30-yard run on Ohio State's defense. Now, granted, they probably had some second stringers in there, but it's Ohio State. Their second stringers would play basically anywhere. But so, yeah, obviously that dynamic works in between the 20s as well, but also the way that Iowa's pass rush attacked, and I'm using air quotes there because Childs was so athletic that if you go back and watch the way that pass rush worked, a lot of times it was as much a matter of contain, like trying to keep him in the tackle box and not, get outside and outside of contain, as it was to try to bring him down, right? You're trying to, at the very least, limit the space that he's allowed to, operate in. And if it's a mobile or if it's an immobile QB, right? If it's, Spartan Petrus back there, you just pin your ears back and go. But the fact that you can't ask your defensive lineman, just go and get him because you know he's too athletic for that. That is how you extend plays. That's how Michigan State extended a lot of plays. And the fact that Iowa sort of has an option like that, and it has been effective in the red zone at the goal line in ways that McNamara has not been effective, up to and including that 2-point conversion where his footwork looked like a scared rabbit, surrounded by coyotes. At some point, you have to acknowledge that athleticism, that escape, or that elusiveness, escapability, might be exactly the dynamic that makes this Iowa offense work. And Eliot, so one more thing, and I put this on the premium board for our subscribers, but you mentioned the deep pass and how it has been missing from this offense. And if you look at PFF, they're when they're talking about the pass depth for Cade McNamara, he's got 151 pass attempts. Only 13 of them have been for over 20 yards downfield. He is 2 for 13 on those throws. That it's such a dramatic drop off, especially like even for 10 to 19, only 50%. But those have been some of his most effective throws. But even then, we're talking about a third of his passes that have been for more than 10 yards downfield. Only about a third. The vast majority of where Iowa's passing offense operates and where Cade is the most effective is within 10 yards or behind the line of scrimmage. And okay, I mean, that if that's where he's most effective, then sure, you might want to use him the most there. The problem is opposing defenses know that. The problem is when your quarterback can't give safeties a reason to not pack the box, to not, smash the area of operation to within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage, then ultimately you're not giving them a whole lot to worry about. Ultimately, you are not doing a whole lot more to keep them on their heels than the Brian Ferentz offense. So maybe Sullivan changes that. Maybe he's a better downfield passer. Maybe just the fact that he can elude and create some more time in ways that McNamara can't is exactly what you need to get those guys open downfield. It's a lot of maybes. And so with Kirk, I'll agree with him on that. There is projection involved when you're talking about, sort of situations against opposing teams and trying to throw downfield. With that, I agree. At some point, especially when your record is 4-3, at some point, you just got to see how it works.
What's the upside, Adam? I do you have anything to add there, Ross? Because I think we're probably good to move on to Northwestern here, unless there's anything you want to add.
I mean, I was just going to add that, there are 2 teams in college football this year that have not thrown a 40-yard pass or longer this season. Michigan is one of them. Iowa is the other one.
This is one of those years where you don't want to be involved with Michigan offensively.
No.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's not a good company to be in. The only other thing I would say about Sullivan is, if you're going to start him, isn't this kind of a good week, or not start him, but play him? Isn't this kind of a good week to do so? Is their opponent on Iowa's schedule that he's going to have more familiarity with than Northwestern? I mean, I would say no. But, there's certainly, I think, some added reasons to maybe give him a shot this week. I would say whether or not, McNamara is struggling, unless, if Cade goes out and lights up Northwestern for 300 yards, then there's no reason for Sullivan to see snaps probably, other than, maybe garbage time. But if we see what we've seen from the Iowa passing game for most of this season, I would say, yeah, give Sullivan a chance. Adam, you were going to add something there.
Just real quick before we move on. If Cade McNamara throws for 300 yards against Northwestern, That will be the first time in how many games do you guys think that Iowa has passed for 300 yards? How many games do you think it will have been? First time in how many games? Any guesses? Either.
I think I saw this stat. Was the last time they did it 2017 with Nate Stanley?
It will be the first time in 60 games. 6-0. 300 yards. We're not talking 400, 500. It is by a factor of 2 the longest drought of 300-yard passing in FBS football. Rutgers is next at 29.
Oh, it's 2024. Throwing for 300 yards isn't that crazy.
No, there's teams that do that in a half. Live in the now.
With all of that said, that's one of those scenarios where I don't know if you remember this, Adam. We were in the press box for the first game against Illinois State, and I said if Iowa scores 70 points, I think I said drop right here and shit my pants. If I'm not going to say
happen.
Yeah, right. I'm not going to say that for 300 yards for Cade. I'll be shocked if it happens. Just like flat out, I will be shocked if a quarterback throws for 300 yards that's wearing black and gold and his name is Cade McNamara. I will be flat out shocked. If there's a game that's going to happen like that the rest of this season, it's Northwestern, because Northwestern's not very good. Looking at their stats, it looks like the passing game is where they're not as good, particularly. They went from Mike Wright, who was a Vanderbilt transfer, as their starter, to Jack Lausch, who Lausch has been more of an athlete than anything. And they just seem to be more of a typical Northwestern team than what we saw last year, right? Like they gave Iowa hell for 4 quarters like everybody else did. But they stick at, but at the same time, what did Kirk say? Iowa's 4-4 in the last 8 years against Northwestern. Like, this is just, they're favored by 14.5, but this game gives me a level of concern because of the history between these two programs. And you guys know that better than me.
Yeah, and going to your point about, sort of expecting or not expecting a certain offensive performance of this team, the one thing that you got to give Northwestern on defense, they've got a pretty strong rushing defense. Like their front 7 is extremely competitive. They give up fewer rushing yards per game than Iowa does, believe it or not. Like they give up 103 yards per game. Iowa gives up 113. Now, the downside or the flip side of that, whichever you want to call it, is there isn't a whole lot of reason to run on Northwestern because their pass defense is even more porous than Iowa's, which is, it's sort of a crazy thing to say. But, I mentioned to Kirk on Tuesday, Iowa is 83rd in pass defense in yards allowed through the air. And he was like, oh, that's not good. Correct. But even then, like Northwestern gives up another, 20, 25 yards per game. Like they're close to 250. So if it would not even be all that much of an aberration if McNamara throws for 300 yards, but one, I don't expect Iowa to be that pass happy. All right. I expect them to, quote, establish the run, or, hashtag establish the run. And I'm not too convinced that that's going to be a great, first opening gambit. But if Iowa can actually establish this passing game, if they can do it with McNamara, it will probably buy him a few more games. It will probably buy him sort of a longer leash. And, especially if Iowa wins and McNamara has a good game, there's going to be a lot of crowing from the podium at the post-game conference from a certain 70-year-old. But can't imagine who that would be. But at the end of the day, this really does sort of seem like a make or break game for Cade McNamara. Ross, do you agree with that?
I think you're right. This is not a good pass defense. You hear about the unstoppable force and the immovable object. Iowa's pass offense against that Northwestern's pass defense is more of the very stoppable force against the very movable object. But so we'll see which is weaker. I guess no. I mean, I think you're right though that McNamara. This is a game. There's a lot of pressure on him just from his performance overall this season. There's the struggles that he's had, especially recently. The Michigan State game. Like you said, Chad likes to go mention that. Without a good drive in that third quarter, he may have actually gotten benched for Sullivan in that game. So, I think he's coming into this game knowing there's a need to perform, and he's facing a pass defense that has not been particularly productive or efficient this season. So, there should be opportunities for him to play well and to put up, hopefully one of his better games of the season. And yeah, if he's not able to do that, I think that's going to open the door wide open for Sullivan to get more playing time in this game, and you would think going forward too.
So when we're talking about get right games as well, there's sort of another dynamic that is probably going to play in Iowa's favor for this game, and that is Iowa's pass defense, which again got lit up to a surprising degree by the Spartans on Saturday. But now you face a team like Northwestern, and Lausch is sort of a dual threat QB. But when you look at Northwestern's actual productivity in the passing game, they, along with Michigan, are the only teams that are worse or certainly less efficient in the passing game than Iowa is. They try to lean on it a little bit more than Iowa, but the actual productivity, the actual, taking care of the ball, et cetera, is not there. And it wasn't there for Mike Wright. It isn't there for Jack Lausch. And, Lausch is still sort of growing into that role as starting quarterback. But this really does seem like an opportunity, especially with Entringer and Castro coming back for the secondary to actually, get a little bit more productivity, start to force those turnovers that they're used to, and really show that that game at East Lansing was more of an aberration for them as opposed to a worrying trend. So, Eliot, would you say that this is a prime opportunity for Iowa's secondary to really get back to form, or are you worried about what Northwestern's skill position guys? Are you worried about that threat that they pose?
I'm not worried about their skill position guys. That's an easy answer.
The end.
And that's HawkCast. Just kidding. Lausch is definitely a dual threat guy. I heard you say that. In watching a little bit of the Wisconsin and Northwestern game this last weekend, Lausch has quick foot speed. So that would be the thing that would give me the most pause, because after what a lot of people were saying, well, it seems like Phil has kind of figured out the mobile quarterback. Well, no, he didn't last week. So that gives me some pause. At the same time, talking a little bit about Cade and the Brendan Sullivan situation, the dynamic against Northwestern. Well, Northwestern's not very good, 3-4 right now, 1-3 in the Big Ten, and so this is probably your last chance to make that change. Again, man, I'll believe it when I see it, but there's an added dynamic of why I would like to see that change happen this weekend, and I want to see if Brendan Sullivan's a killer, right?
Yeah.
Like, being that level of an athlete and a quarterback, to a degree, you kind of have to have that, especially when you're going against a team that was pretty adamant that you're not their full-time starter. Like, don't you want to see him come out, either run or throw all over them and have a look? Because we've seen that fire, right? When he scores and when he's scored through this stretch of games where he's seen the field in goal line situations. I want to see him be a killer against his former team that more or less gave up on him. I really want to see that.
Yeah. Does Brendan Sullivan have that dog in him? It's time to find out. Like that's sort of a serious question. Does he want to put Northwestern in the dirt? I would. I think I would.
To boot, believe it or not, Northwestern's pass defense is probably weaker as opposed to its rush defense. And it might be relative. I'm looking at their yards gained versus yards lost in the run game and the comparative to their defense versus offense in terms of stats for the season. And opposing teams have thrown the ball a lot on them as well. Average yards per attempt is almost 7 as compared to Northwestern's 5.7. Average yards per game, 250 as opposed, 246, 247 versus 166 for Northwestern. 10 touchdowns against the Northwestern defense through the air versus 4 for them. So you look at the difference between the passing offense and rushing offense and how they've done versus Northwestern's defense. And this is an opportunity for Iowa to put the ball in the air, more so than other games that they've had thus far, because the script is out on how you beat Iowa. You load the hell out of the box and make Cade McNamara beat you. Well, add a different dynamic and have Brendan Sullivan do something, because it's not working against a team in Michigan State that's talented but not better than Iowa. It didn't work. And if that didn't work, how's it going to shake out for you the rest of the season? We went from thinking, they might lose a game to Wisconsin or Nebraska in the regular season, other than Ohio State, to now, oh boy, I don't know how I feel about the rest of these games after a 32-20 loss to a mediocre Michigan State team. So it's one of those things where Kirk is absolutely not going to approach the rest of the season like this. But what do you have to lose? Because CFP, Big Ten championship, off the table, out the window now. So yeah, sure. He said yesterday, I don't think college football's changed that much, which was the craziest statement ever when I asked him about this, having these things off the table. And I don't know what he meant by that, as far as like the bowl games ahead or like the opportunity to win a bowl game and win 9 games. But in all reality, now that CFP, now that Big Ten championship are off the table, you don't have anything to lose. You don't have Cade's going to be mad. Like, I'm sorry. Switch it up. Give the ball to Brendan. If it goes poorly, you have nothing to lose. Nothing. Other than one game against Northwestern, who you've been embarrassed by in previous years, lost games you shouldn't have lost. Ross, am I being a little too, I don't know, dramatic, hyperbolic here in some of those things that I said?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, you don't want to just say, oh, bag it for next year or anything like that. But,
Right.
If Sullivan is going to be your top option at quarterback next year, which, he's certainly going to go into spring and, fall practice next year as the favorite, I would imagine. Wouldn't you want to get him some more like real reps this season to see know what you have with him a little bit better under game pressure and in game situations, and B, just to give him more confidence, give him more experience, more connection with he's going to have a lot of these same receivers to throw to next year. So, and especially when what you've been getting from Cade, we've talked about it ad nauseum, it's not good. So, see what you can get with Sullivan, both to maybe improve things this year on the offensive side of the ball, but also to give you a sense of what does next year look like? What do you need to work on or improve, in terms of adding more weapons, or what does Sullivan need to focus on to get better at, to have Iowa more effective throwing the ball next season? Again, not wanting to throw away this season. That's not fair to the current players and especially the seniors. But there's a strong argument to be made that the guy who gives you the best chance to win for the rest of this year and next year is Sullivan. So, why not give him some more shots to see what he can do?
Yeah. Yep. Totally agree with that, Ross. And I've got 3 names here: Brad Banks, Ricky Stanzi, CJ Beathard. All 3 of those guys were essentially, they took over for less mobile QBs. They had great seasons as Hawkeyes. And so much of their transitions into starters, especially over guys that were not too popular ahead of them, so much of that transition and so much of the great seasons that they quarterbacked was helped by getting on the field in years prior or weeks prior, right? 2001 Brad Banks, I've mentioned on this podcast before, saw some series, especially in that Michigan game and later in the season. I think it was the Northwestern game that he played most of that. And that was instrumental in him becoming 2002 Brad Banks. Ricky Stanzi was already sharing snaps with Jake Christensen in 2008. They lose to Pittsburgh, who I bet none of you people who are listening or watching can tell me who Pitt's QB was for that game. Bill Stahl. Ever heard of Bill Stahl? I hadn't. They did have LaShawn McCoy. Shady, everyone knows, but they lost to Bill Stahl. And that was when Kirk finally pulled the trigger, got Stanzi in there, and 2008 became a really special season, even though they still lost 4 games. You look at Rudock and Beathard. Rudock sort of played his way out of that starting QB spot. And it was an off-season change, but it was an immediate off-season change. It was that infamous Kirk Ferentz, like I think it was a Jan 2 or maybe Jan 3 depth chart release, which he never does. But it was his way of saying, all right, we're done with Rudock. And so, but all of that again, and then Beathard obviously became a great QB for the Hawkeyes, especially when he was healthy, went on to the NFL, had a really strong NFL career for somebody who, you know, came from Iowa. And so all of that is preceded by getting on the field. All of that is preceded by growing against competition, getting these snaps. And when Iowa does not give that QB2 these opportunities, you end up with situations like, I believe it was 2012 with James Vandenberg, who struggled mightily in year 1 with Greg Davis, and yet took every single snap, took every single throw for the season. And Iowa's offense just sort of never recovered from that. So ultimately, you have to, especially now that, as we've mentioned before, the big dreams, the big like double-digit win, this, that is effectively off the table. All right, well, if you're the sort of, you know, coach that thinks you don't change horses in the middle of the stream, this is a pretty shallow stream at this point. You know, you got to worry about that next stream. You got to worry about if you're really on the right horse for that next stream, because you can change all you want. This is hoof deep at this point. So this is sort of the opportunity to see, all right, where does Sullivan take this offense? Where do these dynamics actually help? He mentioned it. You're projecting if it's just a practice QB. All right, here's your opportunity to stop projecting. Here is the most porous pass defense you're going to face in the Big Ten. See if Sullivan can throw on it. At some point, it's not a matter of whether McNamara can throw on the Wildcats, because there's 5 games left in the regular season. Who cares, honestly? Like, I know you're trying to win games, but ultimately, don't you really want to know more about what Sullivan can do against a Big Ten pass defense, even a bad one? Because that, I think, seems more instructive for how good Iowa can be next year.
Let's get into score predictions. Hawkeyes taking on the Wildcats in Kinnick Stadium at 2:30 on Saturday. They're favored by 14.5 last I checked. I don't know how much that's moved. And personally, that would make me a little bit nervous. But I don't think, man, it's so much of it shockingly comes down to the offense. I think the defense bounces back big time this weekend. I think 2+ turnovers. I think sacks. Like, this is going to be a game I think Jay Higgins and crew comes out on, with revenge on their mind, even though, with redemption on their mind. We'll say that. So with that said, with how much the Northwestern defense has struggled against the pass, I'm more inclined to say they win by 14+, honestly, if Brendan Sullivan's the starter, as opposed to if Cade is. And I think that should be telling. Now, I'm not going to make a contingent on that, my prediction. I'll just say 24-10 Iowa. How about you guys?
Sure, I'll go next. I got burned on my prediction last week pretty badly, although to be fair, we all did. But
I
but
still need some aloe for my ass after 34-10.
I was only off by 30 points. That's the grand scheme of the universe. That's nothing.
I mean, Elliot, you correctly predicted that the winning team would have 30 points. You were just wrong about who
Which
that would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do like Iowa to bounce back here. It's a good situation for them in terms of, if you're going to bounce back against somebody after that, 32-20 doesn't seem like a really humbling loss, but I feel like that was humbling based on the way they looked on the field. Like Michigan State walked them up and down the field, especially on defense. So, there's a lot for them to be mad about and to want to get some vengeance is probably the wrong word, but just, play better, essentially. And Northwestern's a great team to do that against. So I do like them to win. In terms of the score, I have a hard time picking Iowa by 14 over anyone at this point, based on what we've seen. Although, if everything breaks right on offense and if the defense actually gets back to forcing turnovers, getting stops, it's certainly very possible. But I'm going to go with Iowa 24, Northwestern 14.
Yeah, Ross, I'm more or less in the same boat. I'm a little bit more pessimistic for both offenses, and a big reason is that Northwestern's rush defense, and we know that Iowa is going to want to establish Caleb Johnson. And between the fact that Michigan State was able to keep Caleb from moving the chains, especially on third and shorts, and that Northwestern actually has some productivity and talent in that front seven. I think this is going to be a low-scoring game. I think that this is, as I said before, sort of a make-or-break game for the Iowa offense and Cade McNamara in particular. So, but at the same time, I do think this is a really good opportunity for Iowa's defense to sort of victimize Northwestern. Their blocking is not great. Their pass offense just in general is not great. And I know that Lausch is a dual threat guy, but I don't think he is as dangerous as Childs, and I don't think that he has the weapons that Childs did in the pass game. Their receivers are good. They got complimented by the guys that we talked to on Tuesday, but ultimately I'm picking Iowa 19-9. I don't think it's going to be in much doubt that Iowa ever wins this, or that Iowa would win or lose this game. Like I think it's going to be a convincing 19-9 if such a thing exists. But I am not so sure that this is going to be as productive a day on offense, and just because Iowa will have to go pass heavy. And I don't think that Iowa is comfortable going pass heavy. I don't know if Kirk is. I don't know if Lester is. So we'll see. But my guess is Iowa wins 19-9, but spends probably most of the day up by double digits. Ross, what do you got?
I was just going to say, you mentioned this is a make or break game for the Cade and the offense. If they can't score 20 points on Northwestern, that feels like a break to me.
Might be.
For sure.
Might be.
We'll see. I will say, though, you would not go very broke betting on an Iowa Northwestern game to be a rock fight. So you're probably a little closer to the correct score there. I would maybe with that prediction, Adam.
Yeah, just on vibes alone, hashtag Iowa Northwestern unders feels like a good bet. I have no data to back that up, but I feel confident in that.
All right, we will wrap it up here. We appreciate you tuning into this episode of HawkCast. Drop your score prediction right down there in the comments. Let us know what you're thinking for the game ahead this weekend in Kinnick Stadium, 2:30 kickoff in Iowa City. We appreciate you tuning into this episode of HawkCast, brought to you by Hawkeye Beacon and Iowa.Rivals.com. If you're not a premium subscriber yet, we got a potential commitment on the way for Iowa men's basketball, an official visitor coming up for men's, for football. And so all that intel is going to be there for you on Iowa.Rivals.com for our premium subscribers. Do that today, Iowa.Rivals.com subscribe. We'd love to have you there. Also, like I said, don't forget to drop a like, drop a comment here on YouTube, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. If you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, leave that rate and review. Let us know what you're thinking there, and then subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
Yep.
For now, I am Eliot Clough at Eliot Clough on Twitter, joined by Adam Jacoby and Ross Binder. We will see you next time.